Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you, and I'm glad to be here today. Just to introduce myself quickly, I am Bonnie Oliva-Porter. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am a people strategy and diversity, equity, inclusion consultant. I've been consulting officially for about a year now. I run my own consulting firm, and I also subcontract with two other firms. I'm also a venture scout with FICA Ventures here in Los Angeles. Do a lot of different things. Prior to starting my own consultancy, one of the things that I used to do was work in the startup space. So I worked with a startup called Tala, which is here, based in Los Angeles. And we did credit scoring and lending in emerging markets. And I was there from the time it was an idea in our founder's head to 10 years later, where we were over 600 people across 5 countries around the globe, helped open all of those up and really build our people strategy from the ground up. Prior to that, I was in workforce policy work, HR work from the time I was a teenager, to be honest. My aunt started a employment agency. I'm from New York originally. I was like her receptionist for a couple of summers and just really jumped into that and really love thinking about how we can build workplace cultures so that we get the best and brightest out of our employees. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of slides here just to talk a little bit about the frameworks that I like to use and some of the best practices that we can plug in when we're building our company culture and strategy from the ground up, and just some advice for founders. And I would love for you to if you have any questions, feel free to ask openly. Just want this to be a pretty informal session where we can just talk about how, some of the pressing things that as leaders, we sometimes have to deal with. Again, I mentioned that I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. So we'll talk a little bit about my thoughts around that, like, what that framework looks like. The people team framework. So what is a people team? What does it do? What is one way that we want it to look? The employee life cycle, which is another framework that I use as we're helping build out people strategy. The stages of team development, the global diversity, equity, inclusion benchmarking report. And so these are, again, all frameworks that I use and I kind of plug and play as we're building out our company culture. And then, get to your questions that you may have. I'm really excited to hear, and walk through those in real time. I have this Maya Angelou quote here too. People forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And that's one of the things that for me, as we talk about company culture, is really important and is really accurate. We can write as many policies as we want. We can make sure to create the most, the coolest handbooks and have all the best events and things like that. And at the end of the day, people really want that personal kind of connection. And we're also living in a time when things are changing, things are different. And so we want to make sure to help people find that balance. So one of the things that I always like to do is to kind of set the stage of who's in the room, where we are, as we think about things like building company culture. And we're thinking about the types of workplaces that we've always wanted to be in. One question I always like to ask folks is, when you were young, what did you want to be when you grew up? And this is a Slido. It's an anonymous polling tool. So if you feel like it, you can answer joining at slido.com and putting the number, and you can answer the question. It'll show up. It won't show your name or anything like that, but it's just a kind of a way for us to kind of get to know who is in the room, or you can use the QR code. I like to ask this question a lot of times because I like to think back to like our journeys and how we get to where we are. For me, I always wanted to be, I had a lot of things I wanted to be. I wanted to be an FBI agent. I was really physically wanting to be an FBI agent a lot of the time. And that was because I thought it was like cool action. Then I also wanted to be a therapist. And I think the therapist thing kind of came with me as I built on my HR journey, because it is similar in like helping people and have lots of conversations with people and help them along the way. Flight attendant, a vet. So I always like to think about how we perceive the workplace when we were younger, and then like how does that tie into where we ended up? teacher, professor. Like I see like a lot of leadership here. So I think that is always really interesting. So yeah, I wanted to be an FBI agent and I wanted to be a therapist, and I ended up being like a people strategy DEI consultant. So there's some similarities, but obviously along the way, my journey took a lot of different twists and turns. Thank you for those of you who participated in that poll. I'll talk about DEI because they're not always one and the same, and people strategy and DEI. However, in my work, I always make sure to include diversity, equity, and inclusion as we're building out our team structure, our people team structures, our overall company culture. Sometimes you'll see that companies will decide later on, oh, now we have to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion after everything's been built. And I like to say that DEI is not the table salt, it's the marinade. It's got to be there in the beginning when you are starting things off, because it really shapes the way you think about building out your people processes. So these are just some of the ways that I like to define diversity, equity, inclusion. This is from a website called The Conscious Kid. I love the way that they use terminology that can be used with children to be able to explain some of the pretty difficult and obscure topics. And I want to focus on equity, just for the sake of this presentation. So equity recognizes historical and contemporary oppression that acknowledges that different communities require different types of levels of support to succeed and survive. To achieve equity, policies and procedures may require unequal distribution of resources to redress disparities and disadvantages and achieve equal outcomes. And equity in the workplace is one of my major focuses. When we think about the workforce, the people who are the folks that we hire, that we employ, they are, they are very different than who the workforce itself was actually designed for. So when you think about the workforce of being in an office and working from a structured time of 9 to 5 and commuting, that design was not for most of the people who are working in those positions today. And then you have a different type of workforce that works in essential spaces, in hospitals, in grocery stores, in the areas that keep our economy going. What are the needs and the different things that needs to be put in place to create a equitable workforce for all of the folks in our world who are working today? When we think about building company culture, we often think about diversity as representation and inclusion, and making sure that everyone is involved, and all of those kind of come together when it comes to thinking about equity as a way to make sure you design for everyone who is in your business. And I always talk about the universal design principle, which is that when you design for the people who are the most marginalized, you really serve everyone. So we sometimes believe that when we design for the most marginalized, we're just serving that one group. But the reality is that you're serving, if it reaches the most marginalized group within your organization, you are then serving as many people as possible. And so that's another thing that I like to bring up with my clients or my, in places that I've worked in the past. To demonstrate equity, I love this image here from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It just kind of demonstrates we often confuse and conflate equity and equality. And we often try to achieve equality. What we're really trying to achieve is equity. So equality is giving everyone the same thing. You see this image here, you give everyone the same bike. That bike is not really used by everyone the same way. Not everyone can use that bike. It has, it fits certain needs and it doesn't fit other needs. When you think about equity, this is really a great visual to demonstrate what equity actually means. So it's thinking about meeting folks where they are and meeting them with their needs. So if you produce a bicycle that is comes in different shapes and sizes, it can be used by a variety of people, and a number of different people can have the same experience of being able to ride a bicycle. So this is just a kind of a quick this is just a kind of quick image of what that looks like. And so to where we are now, company culture. how does that get built out? And sometimes, depending on the size of your organization, it can feel like it's really organic. And then you might feel other things come out of nowhere. It is what this quote says. It's, how your team members behave when no one is looking. This is from a book by Ben Horowitz. Your culture is how your company makes decisions when you're not there, you being the leader of your organization. So you may come in and you have all of these different ideas and thoughts of how you want your organization to run. And you can't be in every meeting. You can't be in every presentation. You can't necessarily be with every single employee all the time, especially as you scale. So your culture is kind of the glue that keeps all of that together. And so, he says, if you don't methodically set your culture, then 2/3 of it will end up being accidental and the rest of it will be a mistake. And the point here is you want to be intentional about the culture you end up building at your organization. When we were building out Tala, for example, in the very early days, we were organically just a very diverse company, just based off of who was in the room, the representation around the table. And as we started scaling, we realized we really need and want to be very intentional about how we reach different groups, different communities, and make sure that that continues across the growth of our company. And we'll see that shift happen before you even realize it's happening. So we wanted to make sure that, again, we were intentional about that. And so this brings me to the frameworks that I like to talk about when we're talking about building company culture. One of the things that I do as a consultant is I come in and I do a people practices assessment. And so instead of saying to a potential client, okay, here are all the services that I'll give you or I'll do for you for this rate, the first thing is really thinking about what exists here already, what exists today, and how can we best support you? What are the recommendations to make sure that you build the company that you really want to build? There's so many variables that go into this. And so these are some of the frameworks that we use as we start doing the assessment. And one of them is like, really just thinking about what exists here and what do we know about your people team. And I say people instead of HR because there's a lot more to it. And oftentimes we think of HR as this monolith, right? So HR is the place where you go when there's a problem. HR are the people who like make sure that your paychecks, are done on time and that your benefits are correct. And you go there when you have an issue and they'll deal with it and make sure that the employer is not really, liable for any bad behavior. But really, you really want to see the shift from HR to a people function. You want to build high performing teams. And so in traditional HR, it was informed, reactive, tactical, kind of narrow scope of like, this is what the folks do. And a lot of times there's a misunderstanding of what happens in this area. And the people team is a little bit more holistic. So you're consulted, brought into strategic conversations as your company is building and growing and making sure you're getting ahead of any potential issues that might come up. Deliberate, making sure that you're creating programs that your employees can use as they grow. Strategic, so goal-based programs and initiatives to help with the development of the folks on your team. And again, holistic with a wider view of the business, just making sure that you have somebody on your team or folks on your team who can support your team, who are looking at a lot of different areas and thinking about how do we get the most out of employees? How do we make sure our employees are happy, healthy, and productive, ultimately so that we can grow our business sustainably and so that we are a great place to work and it's competitive. So look into what is a people team. Again, the framework of what are the different areas of work that go into this, kind of mystery that is sometimes thought of as the HR world. So we look at the different verticals that exist and how they are all tied together. So if you're a small organization, you may not have all of these verticals. You may not have a person for each of these areas, or you may have one person who's doing all of this work without even realizing. Some organizations are much bigger and will have whole departments in each of these areas. So you may run the gamut and figure out, kind of where you are and where is it that you want and need to be based on where your business is growing. So the verticals that we look into are talent acquisition, and that is your employer brand. How do folks hear about your organization? What do they know about your organization? What is out in the world about the kind of culture you have at your business? Your long-term hiring planning, what does that look like? And long-term can mean different things depending on the stage of your business. Long-term could be in the next 3 months, or long-term could be in the next year, or even longer than that. So what are the roles that we're going to need to hire for? When are we going to be able to bring those in? And when do we start hiring for those roles? So when do we start the process of hiring for those roles? Sourcing, where do we, actively go and look for potential new hires? Is there a place, is there a partner that helps us bring like quality candidates in the door? And making sure that the sourcing partner is someone who kind of touches all of our needs and make sure that we have a diverse candidate pipeline. The next vertical that I think about and look at is employee relations. And this is the area where most companies or most people who are not in HR think about when they think about HR. It's the area where the payroll and benefits, making sure that that gets done on time and that gets done accurately. There are the work policies, so your employee handbook, all of the rules and regulations, the code of conduct, labor compliance, making sure that you are following local, state, federal guidelines for being an employer. Most states, New York and California specifically, are very, very employee friendly. So if an employer, especially startups, make mistakes, it can cost them a lot of money. So we want to make sure that we understand what those rules and laws are as we're hiring folks, so that we make sure to stay on top of them. And then grievances. What happens when there's a complaint, or people are not getting along, or there's a more serious issue? What does that process look like? Who do people go to? If you're a small organization, that might just be the CEO. Everybody goes, and that's overwhelming, right? There's a lot that can go into that. And this is the area that honestly is one of my favorite places. I love to really think about all, work policies. I really just dive into all of them, read through them with like a fine-tooth comb, and help provide some recommendations around this area to make sure that there's transparency in what it's like to work at this organization, and making sure the company is following all of the rules it needs to follow. Performance is another area that can be a standalone area, and the performance ranges from your individual performance as an employee and making sure that your goals are set and we figure out how you meet your goals, up to what are the overall company goals, strategic goals for the quarter or for the year, and how do those get tied into each other. So we think about making sure that we create a performance process that meets the needs of employees and of the business. This is also an area where we want to be clear about what happens when it comes to performance. When you have a high performer, what does that mean? What does that look like? And then ultimately, how do we develop that high performer? And if we have a performer who's not so high, somebody who's a low performer, how do we handle that as well? So being transparent about what those processes look like, and making sure people know this is where I can go for support, assistance, for help if I need that. Learning and development is the professional development aspect of a people team. So this could be professional development, any additional trainings that you provide, or provide access to workshops. We have folks come in and do workshops for your team, or allow them to go out on their own and go to conferences and do workshops. Your career path. So even in small organizations, I see this all the time. You might be an organization of 5 or 10, and people want to know, how do I get promoted? What's the next step for me? What does that look like? So understanding what that looks like. And then total rewards, which is ultimately all of the benefits that come with working at an organization, and not just like health benefits and medical and those kinds of things, but what is all that goes into being a part of this company, this organization. Compensation, whether that's your salary, your equity, additional perks that you might have, volunteer opportunities, things like that. What does that package look like today? And what do we want to get to eventually? And how do we, kind of build that roadmap? And all of these things together are, also have a high touch with company culture and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So that's all kind of, it can be one thing. And this is where you might see an organization that is small and has one person doing all of these things. And you may think like, why is my people operations person or my HR person so stressed and frazzled? Well, they're doing a lot, right? And there's a lot of different things that go into it. And we may not even know that we are doing all of those things at once. It may not look like that. But ultimately, these are all of the things that go into building a company culture, people team framework. And so ideally, as your business grows, you will be able to come into this, each of these verticals over time, build them out, and make sure you have folks who are specifically focused on some of those roles. The next framework we're going to look at is the employee life cycle, whereas the last framework is really how does the business really handle all of these different people, structures, and processes. And this one is more about what is it like for an individual who comes into your organization, and what is their experience like throughout their entire time there. Everything from onboarding, developing, performing, engage and motivate, and then separate, because we are living in times where folks no longer necessarily work at the same company for 40 plus years and retire with, a fancy gift at the end of that time. What does separation look like without it necessarily being something that is really dramatic or something that is done because there was an issue? So making sure that we have processes in place for all of these different pieces. So I'll go through a little bit for each one in particular. So onboard, right? This is one that we had some questions about in the Q&A before that came in beforehand. A good onboarding plan, helps people feel welcome and increases the likelihood of retention. So we know that when you onboard someone in the right way, they are able to become very productive a lot sooner. So you want to be able to have some, couple of quick things that you can have is making sure that their welcome package, their paperwork and systems are completely set up, that they are able to, be connected to the right people for the right things. Like this is who you go to for what. A thing that I always urge and stress is a 30, 60, 90-day plan or some sort of roadmap. And that doesn't need to be a long, crazy document. It could just be, in the first 30 days, we want you to get familiar with our systems. In our 60 days, we want you to start taking ownership of a particular project. And within 90 days, we want to see you now have had an impact on the project that you've taken over and are leading it without any issues. And so figuring out what that roadmap looks like, and your job description really should help influence that as well. So what are the needs of this role, and what is this person going to be taking over, so that they are able to really start as soon as possible. Develop. So when somebody comes through your organization, you want them to have some sort of continued development, professional development experience that allows them to continue to learn and feel that they're building. And this is a really important part, especially at startups, because again, there may not be a very clear next position or step for them, but we want people to feel like they're constantly and consistently growing. A really great article that I love to share with folks, it's a couple of years old now. It's called Give Away Your Legos. Another tip for scaling startups, and I can send that when I send the slide deck afterwards. But it really talks about how at startups, our jobs kind of shift and change every couple of months, and getting comfortable with that is one way to know that you're continually developing. Perform. Again, we look at we look at performance as a business, but also from the employee perspective. What does employee performance look like? What is good performance, and what does that lead to? And so sometimes we look at performance and think two things. So we think about how well an employee executes against goals and expectations, and that's behavior to support the company's strategic objectives. Or we look at performance development, so enablement or learning, inspiring, equipping, and enabling employees to greater levels of performance. So how do we get someone to, really reach the potential that they completely have. And that can come with mentorship or things outside of the organization as well. But this is a really important part because it's twofold. It is the business obviously needs an employee to perform well. And an employee, one of my overall assumptions when I go into this work is that people want to perform at a high level, and they just need the tools and the resources to be able to do that. Engage and motivate. So once your employees have been there for a while, things are shifting, things are changing, we want to keep them engaged. And this is an area where feedback is really critical. So how do you get feedback from employees and make sure that you are acknowledging that they're giving you feedback and that you're responding to the feedback that you hear. So if there are themes that come up, find ways to respond to that and let them know, yes, we are listening. And some of those things are things that if you want to address them, it may take some time. So also let them know that as part of the people practices assessment that we do at Amplify 11, we also do listening sessions. So we kind of get some conversations with employees to hear about what's going on, what are some themes that are bubbling up that need to be addressed that haven't been discussed before. And then we want to recognize employees for their work in some way, shape, or form. Even the smallest ways, small tokens can really go a long way, whether it's like, here's a small, anniversary gift, or, we send you some sort of something in the mail just to say thank you. Or when you do something really, really well, find ways that you have a ritual within your organization to acknowledge that work and make sure that it's something that you are able to do for a lot of people, not like, hey, the same person is getting praise over and over again at every single meeting. Finding small ways to thank and recognize folks goes a long way. And lastly, separate. So, employees will inevitably transition out of the company. That's something that happens. And it's important to, at the beginning, as you're building out your people team structure, to understand like what happens when a person leaves. So there's the legal things that needs to happen when a person leaves, making sure that they get their last paycheck on their last day, making sure that anything that's owed to them is paid to them right away. Because these are things that you can also get into a lot of trouble for not doing well. And also, like, what is the alumni network that might exist? What are ways for them to stay in touch? Are they welcome to return back at some point? Are you going to be able to provide them with references or recommendations and so on and so forth? You can always keep that relationship kind. And even if a person has to leave because they're not high performers, or you've come to this decision that it's not a mutual fit, there are ways to have that conversation so that everyone leaves at least satisfied. It doesn't mean everyone's gonna leave happy, but you can make sure that that happens in a way that is human, that is kind, and that allows you to continue to have conversations if that is what you want. It just doesn't have to be dramatic. And then lastly, one of my other favorite frameworks, well, this is not the last one, I have one more after this, but forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning is like the stages of team development. I think it's important to recognize too that every time there's a shift or a change on your team, that impacts how the team functions. And so knowing that there are different stages actually helps you get through those stages actually a lot more quickly. So, forming, when a new person, joins a team, they have to learn what are the new agreements of this team now? What does this person bring into this organization or this group? Trying to figure out like what your guidance or your purpose is. Storming is that moment of, okay, there's newness here, something's uncomfortable, something's not really working the way we're used to it working. You kind of have to go through this period of figuring things out. So finding clarity where it might be lacking, but there's something happens typically that kind of forces those conversations. Norming is, all right, this is, we've figured out where we need clarity. Now we're creating that clarity. We're coming up with agreements, consensus, clear roles and responsibilities. And then you kind of get to work, right? The performing part, right? Now we all know how to work together. Now we all know what needs to get done, how to get those things done. These are our, weekly, monthly check-ins or whatever you do, and making sure that you have that purpose, that delegation, and that those goals are set. And then adjourning, right? Once you've completed a project, all right, how do we celebrate what we've done together? What are the next steps that come from here? And that's a cycle that continues. So You'll see that as your team grows, as you add new people to your team, as your teams themselves grow and build amongst themselves, as you go through different projects, you'll kind of go through all of these different stages, and you'll be able to understand how to better lead when these things are actually happening and recognize when they are happening. Last framework I'll talk about is the Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Benchmarking Report. This is another kind of free tool that is able for folks, you're able to go out and use. I'll send the link for this as well. It's an 80-page report that was come up, it was like 112, I think, expert panelists that just talked about 275 benchmarks that are built to help us understand where we are on our DEI journeys within our organizations. It's got a couple of different areas, so internal, external, bridging, and foundation, and there's 15 categories across all of those benchmarks. When I look at the people practices assessment, looking at this internal area here for the different best practices around recruitment, advancement, compensation, benefits, and flexibility. And it has it's a 1 to 5 range, a leveling range. So 1 being inactive, like we are not doing this yet, or 5 being we're best practice. And what's good about this report is that it gives you a guide for where you could look at, like, we want to aim to be here, and you can help work backwards from there. So if you find a best practice, you might then say, we'll be in this place in a year, and this is the thing, these are the things that we're going to do. We're going to build a roadmap to get to that point. So it's a really good tool that I definitely recommend folks using. This is just a little bit about the GDEIB. Again, there's 15 categories and 275 benchmarks across those categories that are then rated from 1 to 5. And here you have the different levels, inactive to best practice. And I can go over a little of that in detail, but I'd love to get to your questions. Before I kind of finish off this part of it, just some intentions and assumptions when I think about, again, building company culture, working on a people practices assessment when I work with clients, that universal design principle, when you design for the most marginalized, you serve absolutely everyone. Or, not everyone, but most people. And we see that with the curb cut effect, that folks have heard about that specific concept or principle, back when veterans were coming back from World War II, we saw like this huge uproar around building the curb cuts in the sidewalk that was specifically for veterans, and then realize that when those curb cuts are created, they're not just for people who are in wheelchairs or might be disabled. Those can be used by many, many people for many different reasons. And so it's actually beneficial for a large part of the population, as opposed to just thinking about it serving one group. Like I mentioned before, everyone wants to show up and do a good job. And so oftentimes when we're building out people practices, we can't help but think of, well, what happens if this bad thing happens? Or if somebody is dishonest, or if somebody is looking to take advantage. And we can't design around that idea and those thoughts or those concepts, because then we end up limiting ourselves and limiting the folks who will show up and will do the work and perform at a high level. As leaders, we must be intentional about the culture we want to build. So what are those things? What are some of those highlights of, going back to what you wanted to do when you were a kid? What's the workplace that you want to be in? And what are some of those things that are non-negotiables for you? And how do we build that into our culture in a kind way? One thing I didn't really get to talk about much was how decisions are made is just as important, if not more important, than what decisions are made. And so when we think about building company culture, it's not just like the fun perks and the foosball tables and the weekly lunches or what have you. It's also that transparency, which is incredibly important. Folks need to know how we make difficult choices in our organization, and finding a process for that is almost more important than just figuring out what that outcome. So if it's the kind of thing where the CEO has the last and final say. Making that clear is incredibly important, so that we can continue to have open, honest conversations. And so I have some work around decision matrices and how those are done, and the different escalation processes that happen when a big decision needs to be made at your organization. It may seem like a little thing. This is one of those implicit power structures, and something that is important to bring to the table. A few quick tips for building company culture. Opening up your recruiting pipeline. So where you recruit from is incredibly important, making sure that you go out of your way, above and beyond, to find as many people as possible to fill particular roles. And so that could mean looking at things around your JD, what kind of language you use in that JD, who might that deter? Looking at things like education requirements. Are those really important? And how does that really impact your performance in a role? So you might naturally think that by having this BA or JD or whatever requirement you think you want and need for a role. Well, for some roles, obviously you need a JD, but the requirements that you need for a role, remember that access to education isn't equitable, right? And so you might have someone who can pick something up really quickly. There might be alternative methods to learn a specific skill or trade, and thinking about how we can open that up to make that more accessible. Have the uncomfortable conversations. I've seen this be one of the biggest things with my clients or just in previous workplaces. Sometimes we don't want to have certain conversations. Sometimes they're hard to have. It's hard to say you are not performing at the level you need to be performing at, or you're not performing up to par, or you have the conversation and it's not done well. And there are really great ways to have those conversations, but don't avoid it, and you can do it in a kind way. Find creative ways to engage your team in this work. And I'll talk a little bit about an exercise that I like to do with the different clients that I've worked with. And lastly, just this is long-term work. The change takes time. If you're building company culture, it's not a quarterly goal. Like, we're going to build our culture in Q1. That's not how it works. You're talking about, shifts in behaviors and defining what it is that you want to do. And it is okay to take your time to do that, as long as you describe that and you're open and you're transparent. And that is, a couple of quick tips. The margins, mainstream, and missing exercise is one that I like to do, which is a quick way to engage your employees in some of these conversations. So your employees, it's kind of there's an online whiteboard tool that I use. You can use whichever one you want, or you could have a whiteboard in your office if you're somewhere physically. And it's just kind of like a bullseye with 3 levels. So mainstream is in the center, the outer one is the margins, and the most outer one is the missing. So thinking about the characteristics of each of those at your organization. So you can kind of understand, like, get a baseline of what your culture actually looks like. So who's on the mainstream on your culture? What are the characteristics of folks on the mainstream? What are the characteristics of folks on the margins? And what are the voices and characteristics that are actually missing from your organization? It's a quick thing, and I've seen, every time I've done this exercise, folks love it and will tell you, like, very honestly what they feel. And it's just a good way to get a pulse check for what is happening within the company. And when I say characteristics, I don't mean like very specific naming people. It's all anonymous. It can be done where you don't see what other folks are putting on their whiteboards if you're doing it remotely. And you're not saying, like, calling anyone out specifically, but you might be saying, there are things that I tend to see that you wouldn't know about unless you asked. So one example that I always use when it comes to this exercise, back when we were in, more so in person, and we were having a lot of events in the startup world, in the tech world, one thing that I often saw on the margins in that space was folks who don't drink are on the margins. And this was something that came up and comes up consistently. It's one of those things where you may not realize as you're planning an event that, there are a number of folks out there who don't drink for so many different reasons. And our events aren't necessarily catered to those individuals. So thinking about that as something that can shift things. So we can learn more than we think when we do simple exercises like that. And that's it. So I just have, would love to get your feedback or any questions that you might have specifically. Elizabeth, I know that there were some questions. Yeah, so would love to just start having the conversation. I know we don't have that much time left.
Yeah, I would encourage folks to put any specific questions that they have in the chat, or if there's a scenario you want to talk through or challenges that you're currently having. And in the meantime, I'll pull up some of the questions that were pre-submitted and share them as well.
All right, I see. How can you tell if a new hire isn't working out? That's a really good question. There are lots of ways to tell if a new hire isn't working out. I think the first thing is, what was this person hired to do? Is there an understanding of what this person is supposed to take on and handle? Are they supposed to assist? Are they supposed to lead? And are they doing either one of those things well? When you have a new hire that, I talked a little bit about that onboarding plan, it's always good to have someone really walk them through those, even if it's that first week, which I know can be hard when you are limited to the number of staff or employees that you have at your organization. You should be able to really get a sense in those first 30 days, like, is this person going to really take on the work? Do they have all of the things they need? And then just check in, right? Just, those 30, 60, 90 days are just a kind of a guide, but is there a weekly check-in that you can do with this person to really, specifically ask, like, are they able to, do they have all the information they need? Are they struggling with anything? Do they need additional support? And you can always try to find, implement ways in that onboarding plan to measure the success of a hire. I'm also a big proponent of, if it's not working out and you know that, then it's time to have a conversation about performance, whether it's early on or later. So making sure that they know these are the things that we expect you to hit in this 30, 60, 90 days. And measuring them against that is useful, but also kind of walking them through, this is what we're supposed to do. And if you're not meeting something immediately, bring that up. That also is something that ends up happening, is there might be a mistake and we say, oh, we'll let it slide. And then it just kind of snowballs. So, be open, be transparent, have a plan in place. And if it really isn't working out, you'll know because you'll have something to measure against that. So you'll be able to say, these are the things you were supposed to do and you haven't completed them, or you haven't been able to get this done. Figuring out the why in those feedback sessions. And if you don't see an improvement, you will then need to have the conversation about what happens next. If it's maybe you're better off in a different type of role, or maybe you're better off separating, but have that conversation relatively quickly. Oh, let's see. I hope that answered your question, whoever asked that. How much should I let on about cash flow and fundraising and the general chaos of a startup? I'm guessing this is a question about the interview process. I think it's going to be really important for folks to know, coming into a startup, if they're not familiar with startup, working at startups, that yes, it is chaotic. It changes very quickly. You have to be comfortable with the aggressive nature of those kinds of changes. So letting folks know. Fundraising is a little bit more tricky because it depends on where you are in your fundraising process. If there's a certain amount that you're looking to raise, if there's some certain things you can't disclose based off of who your funders are or where you are in the term sheet process, those kinds of things. But you can always allude to, we're raising our pre-seed or seed or series A, B, or C, and this is what this funding is going to allow us to do. I also hear something in that question around like compensation and like, should we, negotiate compensation? And the answer to that is that, you know, you should always be prepared to answer questions around compensation, no matter what. You know, as you're building out compensation plans and tools, this is also one of my favorite things, knowing really what the market is calling for a specific role or team or group of folks, and being able to describe, like, you know, what your relationship to that is at this company. Like, we, you know, recognize that the market calls for this. We pay at 75% of market because we are series, you know, A or pre-seed company, and we plan to, you know, make it up later on, et cetera, et cetera. So there are things that can be discussed around that. Oftentimes, you know, employees who are coming in to work at a startup know that they're taking a risk, and the type of employee that is looking for the type of salary they would get at a, you know, Google or Facebook, you know, may not be the type of employee who's able to manage working at a startup. So there are some things there that you want to be able to make sure that they understand before they kind of come in. How do you screen candidates for cultural fitness and fit? Ooh, this one is really, really good. I think there's a couple of things here. There's, first of all, describing what your culture is. What is your vision? What are some of the values that your company really, really cares about and supports and matter to your organization? And there are a couple of things you can do. You can ask questions based off of those values. You can ask folks what is challenging for them about those values. You can ask them what is exciting for them about those values, and you can kind of ask some of those questions up front. We don't want to ask, and you know, we know that cultural interviews can really fuel a lot of bias and biases. So you want to be able to identify that up front with your interviewers and make sure your hiring panel, even if it's just you, is aware of, like, you know, how bias can creep into interviews, and try to work against that and think about, you know, how you can, you know, what questions you have for yourself and how you can create questions around the team culture and values that you enjoy, and what are the values that you might want to change, or anything about your culture that you want to change, and be open to sharing that information or answering questions about those things that might be a little bit difficult. But culture fit is one of those things that, you know, again, we know it doesn't necessarily, it's not an indicator of how a person will perform in a role. You know, you might have people at your company who are not 100% part of your culture, you know, necessarily, like offline, and that's okay as well. So you really have to think about what really matters to you when it comes to cultural add or cultural fit within your organization. What steps can I take to confirm that applicants will show up to the interview? This is interesting because it reminds me of interviewing in other countries where there are, you know, places where folks will be on the board for an interview and then will not show up, and that's just literally part of the culture of places that we've worked and interviewed, and there really isn't anything you can do about that. If somebody doesn't show up for the interview and they don't have, like, a good reason for it, then they're just no longer on the, you know, on the list to be hired, unless you really want that person to show up. Then maybe there's something there about making sure that they're confirmed, double checking. You can add workflows into your interview processes depending on what ATS you're using and what you're recruiting. If you have a recruiter or recruiting team who can make sure to, you know, coordinate and double check that that is happening. But if there's somebody who, you know, you really want to woo and wow, you know, a little bit of extra checking in doesn't hurt. How do you create handbooks people will actually read? Oh, this is a good one. These are all good questions, but the handbook question, and I'm actually going to stop sharing now. So the handbook question is a really good one because they're boring. They're very dry documents that most people, unless you're someone like me who loves them, will not read. I've seen some really cool ways to put that together. So you can, instead of it having just be a full-on document, maybe there's a slide deck that you have. Maybe if it's in your whatever system you use to share information, it's there as a different kind of tool. So I've seen it as like a kind of a web book where you go through and somebody is like actually explaining to you in person, like what is going on. That might take a little bit more work to develop. You know, I've also seen that you have to initial every page after you've read it to kind of show that you've read it. So these are things that can be done. The other thing I say is make sure it includes information people actually care about. So again, they're the things that we have to have in there, right? The things that because of compliance, we want to make sure that our employees know. And then there are like some of the, what are the highlights? What are the things that we want to pull out of that we need people to know? So one big example for me on that is the leave policies. Sometimes, you know, the leave policies can be very tricky, especially when you're thinking about longer term leaves, whether there's some sort of sick leave or parental leave or, you know, disability leave that you might have to take. What are the facts people need to know around that? What do people need to know about how much they make during those periods of time? How long does it last? What is the process and paperwork? So just making sure that it does contain the information people need and like that highlight of those information, of that information. How early should you start and what are the most important things to building culture? You know, start as soon as you build your company. And when you make your first hire, making sure that you know, you get to design as a leader the company you want to build. Like, what is the company that you want to work for? As a CEO or leader, we're not often privy to what it's like to work you know, in other types of roles. So we have to kind of do the work to imagine ourselves in those roles and just think like, what if I wasn't in all of the board meetings and I wasn't in all these leadership team meetings? What would I want to know? If I were early on in my career and I really wanted to, you know, make a good impression, where would I want to work? What am I looking for on a team? And I think asking your team, right? Asking them what it is, if you're bringing folks in, what are some great ways to get them engaged and involved? There was that mainstream margins and missing exercise, which I really enjoy. And then there are opportunities to, you know, ask your team to lead different activities, you know, just within reason. Screening for a cultural fit attitude is key, but question is how to evaluate it in the candidate. So I'm curious about this question, how to evaluate that cultural fit in the candidate. I think you know, what I'm hearing in this question is kind of like, you know, folks will show up to an interview and be the version they think that you want to see, and then may be different when they come up. And I think that there are some really pointed questions that can be asked in this part of the interview around, you know, here are our values. One question I ask in every interview, no matter what, is, you know, what makes you excited about the possibility of working at this company, and what makes you nervous? And those, you know, the people get caught off guard by that "what makes you nervous" question sometimes, but it allows folks to be a little bit vulnerable. And so showing up as an interviewer with a little bit of vulnerability is useful, and also kind of asking a question that helps you see like what's some realness or some truth that comes out of this potential interview. And that might help you kind of decide like, is this a person I want to work with? And let's remember that interviews, you know, you always show up being the best version of yourself possible. And when you're in the job, you will face hard things. You will have difficult decisions that you have to make. And so thinking about how do we screen for that in the interview process without there being too much bias. And that can be difficult, but we can, you know, there are definitely like interview questions that you can look up around this. And, you know, just make sure that, you know, with your team of hiring managers, interviewers, whomever, that, you know, you're not asking questions that might be discriminatory or illegal, but that kind of gets to the heart of what you're trying to figure out.